Okay, we're going to start in on chapter 12 and we're combining that with chapter 13. So we're going to be combining the blood and the heart together, even though your book will separate them into two different chapters. So we're going to start with the blood and what makes up the blood. The functions of blood: we transport gases, nutrients, and waste products. Like oxygen is a gas that gets dissolved in your blood and carried on red blood cells to the rest of your body. It carries nutrients also, and then waste products like carbon dioxide will go through your blood to be released through your lungs. Transport of processed molecules, like the precursors of vitamin D, so it takes it from your skin to your liver and then to your kidneys. Your blood is what's transporting those kind of molecules. Transport of regulatory molecules, other molecules like hormones, will be produced by glands, released into your blood, and taken to different parts of your body. Regulation of pH and osmosis. So normal pH in most body tissues is between 7.35 and 7.45, and depending on the dissolved substances in your blood, it will change the pH. It can change the osmotic pressure also between the cells. So the cells need a certain amount of fluid and osmotic pressure for a correct function, and so the blood helps maintain that. Maintenance of body temperature. So warm blood is shunted to the interior of the body, or let's say you are exercising, you get the first thing that happens is your blood vessels, the capillaries in your skin, start to dilate to release extra heat. That's the first step before you really start to sweat. Or if you're really cold, the blood vessels will constrict and keep all that blood in the interior of your body. Protection against foreign substances. Antibodies are in your blood. They will recognize, they're proteins that recognize markers on foreign substances. And so if bacteria or virus or anything come into your body, they recognize it, mark it for your white blood cells, which are your immune system in your blood, will come and attack and try to fight off that infection. And then also there are proteins in your blood that help with the formation of clots, which we know is very important for if there's a cut or any damage to any tissues. So most of your blood is actually plasma, and then there are formed elements within that. And the formed elements are the cells and the cell fragments, so the white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets. Plasma is all the liquid, and it's slightly over half of the total blood volume. And in general, there's about 4 to 5 liters of blood in females and 5 to 6 liters of blood at one time in males. And it makes up about 8% of your total body weight. So the plasma, the liquid part of the blood, is a colloid, meaning it's a liquid that contains suspended substances that don't settle out of solution. So you have gelatin is an example of a colloid, but so you have a liquid, the molecules are not going to settle. Like muddy water is not a colloid, it's a suspension, because if you let that muddy water sit for an hour or two, you're going to have particles settle to the bottom. A colloid would not do that. 91% of that plasma is water, and then the rest of it is proteins, ions, nutrients, waste products, gases, and regulatory substances like hormones. So that there's 3 types of proteins. Albumins, they contribute to the viscosity. Viscosity is the rate of flow, so the thickness of blood helps regulate the osmotic pressure and will transport fatty acids. Globulins transport lipids. They also are part of the immune system. They make up the antibodies that are floating around in your blood. And the clotting factors, like when we get to hemostasis, we'll talk a lot about the formation of a clot and how that works. And then fibrinogen is very important in blood clotting. It's an inactive form, so you always have fibrinogen in your body. Once you have a cut or something, there's the clotting factors, that those globulins, they get released, and they convert that fibrinogen into fibrin, which will start the clotting process. So fibrinogen is sometimes called a precursor, but it's always in your blood, but you don't want it activated all the time because you'd be forming clots all over. So it's inactive until clotting factors are released, then it's converted into fibrin. Ions like sodium, potassium, calcium, those ions that we need for muscle contraction, the electrolytes, are involved in osmosis, membrane potentials, like in a muscle contraction, and acid-base balance. Nutrients like glucose, amino acids, triglycerols, cholesterols, vitamins, they are all dissolved in the plasma. And then waste products, urea and uric acid are a big waste product that get transported through your blood. Bilirubin is transported from your spleen to your liver, and bilirubin gets formed when red blood cells die and they break down, and we'll learn more about that in a little bit. Lactic acid, it's the end product of anaerobic respiration. If you remember, you don't produce much ATP in anaerobic respiration, and one of the products of that is lactic acid, so your blood will transport that waste product. We're very familiar with the gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. Now, most of the oxygen in your blood get transported by red blood cells, but there is a small amount of oxygen that's actually dissolved in the plasma, along with carbon dioxide. And then regulatory substance, we talked about the hormones already. There are some enzymes. Remember, enzymes catalyze different reactions. So this is what it's called hematocrit, but if you take your blood and you put it through a centrifuge, which spins really fast, so all the heavy stuff gets pulled to the bottom and the lighter things are on the top, you'll see that the formed elements, 45%, go to the bottom, and most of this is made up of red blood cells. There's some white blood cells and platelets that are in that formed element portion. In that buffy coat, I guess, that's called the buffy coat. And then the plasma, out of the plasma, most of it is water. There's some proteins and other solutes like the ions, nutrients. So this just shows a breakdown of the different blood components. This chart you can find in your book, similar to this, where it gives just the different components that we talked about already on one chart. Okay, the formed elements, there are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Red blood cells are called erythrocytes. The prefix erythro means red, and then cytes means cell, so you have red cells, red blood cells. Most of the formed elements are red blood cells. They are biconcave discs, meaning on each side they're indented. It looks kind of like a breath mint, a lifesaver type thing where it's indented in the middle. They actually have no nucleus, so in their formation they get rid of their nucleus, which means that they do not live very long. They contain hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is very important to the oxygen carrying. It's the oxygen carrying molecule, and it will also transport carbon dioxide to be released. White blood cells are called leukocytes. Leuko means white, and cytes cell, so white blood cells. So leuko, we also have that prefix in leukemia, which is a cancer of the white blood cells. Granulocytes and agranulocytes are the two main breakdowns of white blood cells. So granulocytes mean you'd see these large granules in their plasma, and usually they have multi-lobe nuclei. We'll look at some pictures here. And there are neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils are the granulocytes. Agranulocytes do not have large granules. They might have little small or no granules. They are not lobed. The nuclei are not lobed. And there's lymphocytes and monocytes. And then platelets, also called thrombocytes. They are cell fragments. So they aren't even a full cell. It's kind of a pinched off portion of a cell. And they form platelet plugs that help stop, it's the second step in stopping bleeding, and that help release the chemicals, those blood clotting factors, that would then activate the fibrinogen into fibrin to form a clot. So the production of formed elements is a process called hematopoiesis or hemopoiesis. They all form from the same stem cells, so they all come from that same population. And if you remember from when we talked about the skeletal system, hematopoiesis, formation of red blood cells, occur in your bone marrow, mostly in adults. In the fetus, it can occur in a couple different more parts of your body, like the liver and lymph nodes, but mostly in the red bone marrow, especially after birth. So here's some pictures of the red blood cell. Here's a picture, but the different types of white blood cells. So this is what a multi-lobe nuclei, see how it's kind of bumped out several different places. You can see these large dots. Those are those granules that you see. These are just weird looking nuclei, whereas the agranulocytes have more of a normal looking nuclei, not very big granules in there. And then platelets are itty bitty tiny things compared to the red blood cells. White blood cells are actually bigger than red blood cells too. When we look at a microscope slide picture, you'll see that the white blood cells are much bigger than the red blood cells. And this is the step of hematopoiesis. So here's your stem cell, a blast cell, and it can form depending on what is needed. It can form into all these different types of cells. So if you need the red blood cell, you produce an erythroblast first, and then it will go through these phases to become a red blood cell. Here are some granulocytes, the way that they produce. And here's that megakaryoblast, where you can see at this step just parts of the cell membrane and plasma pinch off, and that's what the platelets are. So they're really cell fragments. They're not really a full cell. You don't have to know all these steps to the hematopoiesis. Just know that it comes from a stem cell. They all come from the same kind of stem cell. We do need to know that platelets are just cell fragments. There. You do need to know that at this step, you don't know which step, but that the red blood cells do get rid of their nucleus, so they're anuclei. So okay, males in general have more red blood cells than in females. Here you can see this is a good picture of the biconcave shape. So we have a concave side here and a concave side here. You can also see kind of the size. This would be an electron microscope picture where you have electron microscope. You have the red blood cell, and you can see how the white blood cells, a lot of them are going to be bigger, even bigger than this sometimes. And then the platelets are little cell fragments here that are really tiny. Biconcave shape increases the surface area to allow for more gases to move in and out of cells. So you need a lot of gas diffusion. That's the whole purpose of a red blood cell, and so it increases the surface area for that. They only live about 110 to 120 days, so they do not have a long lifespan. And the main component is hemoglobin. A third of its volume is hemoglobin, and that gives it its red color. So this is a picture of hemoglobin. Each hemoglobin molecule is made up of actually 4 proteins, so they're globulins. Here's one, here's one, here's one, and here's one. So there's 4 different globulin proteins here together. And then this blue part right here, this is called the heme portion. So that's where it gets its name, hemoglobin. So then in this heme, if you look here, there is a bunch of carbon molecules surrounding an iron molecule. So that's why they always talk about iron being really important for blood, or for if you're anemic, you have to take iron supplements, because hemoglobin requires a lot of iron. There's 4 molecules of iron in each hemoglobin molecule. So you have to have quite a bit of iron for all the hemoglobin that you need. So we just talked about that, 4 globulin proteins. It transports carbon dioxide, nitric oxide, which is this NO molecule. There's 4 heme molecules, and each one has an iron, and it transports the oxygen. So the function of red blood cells is to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. So 98% of the oxygen that you inhale gets attached to hemoglobin, only 1.5% is dissolved in the plasma. So, and carbon dioxide from your tissues to lungs, 7% are dissolved in the plasma. 23% get put in with the globulin part with the hemoglobin. And then 70% is actually transported as bicarbonate ions because the carbon dioxide here reacts with the water in your blood and it produces bicarbonate with the enzyme carbonic anhydrase that is found within red blood cells, but most of it is actually transported as bicarbonate and then released. Erythropoiesis is the life cycle of a red blood cell. So in normal conditions, 2.5 million red blood cells are destroyed per second. So you are going through a lot of red blood cells, and you're producing, you have to produce that much red blood cells to keep your formed element, the red blood cell concentration high enough. Red blood cells last 120 days. We talked about it because it doesn't have a nucleus. There's really no organelles within a red blood cell, so it's not maintaining the cell at all. It has the hemoglobin pretty much in it. So the whole process from stem cell all the way into the destruction of the red blood cell is called the erythropoiesis. Now, the hormone erythropoietin, very close in name, will stimulate red blood cell production. So if your oxygen levels get really low, your body knows that you need more oxygen. What carries the oxygen is the red blood cell, so it's going to stimulate red blood cell production by producing the erythropoietin. So that's a very important hormone. Okay, when red blood cells get broken down, they will, let's see, where's step number 1? They will be taken to the spleen. The spleen is where the breakdown of red blood cells occurs. So you have a macrophage in the spleen. These aged blood cells get engulfed by that macrophage and broken down. And so you have the hemoglobin part gets reused. The globin part gets broken down into the individual amino acids, taken out into your blood again and reused, either to make more red blood cells or it can be used in other parts of your body also. The iron here gets taken back and to your red bone marrow and reused for more red blood cell production. And then the bilirubin is a byproduct of the hemoglobin breakdown. That gets taken to your liver. The bilirubin gets put into your bile. It gets deposited in the intestine and it will get released through your waste product, through the feces. Bilirubin, if your liver is not working correctly, if you have liver problems, the bilirubin will start to back up and start to build up in the blood, which is what gives you a yellow color in your skin even, and that is the jaundice color that you see sometimes in young or people that are starting having liver failure when they're a little older. If they have cirrhosis of the liver, sometimes the liver stops functioning correctly, bilirubin starts to build up and they get that yellowish color in their skin. Okay, white blood cells, they have the nucleus. We looked at that. Some of them have that weird looking nucleus. They're transported by the blood, but if there is some sort of wound or somewhere that it needs to go to attack a foreign substance, they will leave the blood vessels and can kind of migrate through body tissues. Their main goal or their main function is to protect the body against microorganisms, remove dead cells and debris. And we talked about the difference between granulocytes and agranulocytes. The granulocytes, the neutrophils, we just need to know what their functions are. We don't have to know all these little details. But they phagocytize bacteria and antigen-antibody complexes. So if your body will send an antigen, will recognize if something's foreign. It'll attach to that foreign molecule. Then the neutrophil knows what to phagocytize and to digest. When they die, it's part of the cell debris and the fluid as the pus in that wound. It's the highest amount of white blood cells are neutrophils, so they're an important part. Eosinophils are part of the inflammatory response, and it helps destroy inflammatory chemicals like histamine. So histamine is producing this inflammatory response. If you didn't get rid of it, you would always have this inflammatory response. So eosinophils are what help destroy that. They're also involved in destroying different kinds of worms. We usually don't have that much of that problem here, but they do. Tapeworms, flukes, pinworms, and hookworms. They help fight against those. And the last kind of granulocyte is a basophil. The smallest amount of granulocytes are the basophil, the least common, and they also have a role in the inflammatory response, but they help produce the histamine and heparin in the inflammatory response, and then the eosinophils here destroy those chemicals, the histamine. So the eosinophils and basophils work together in the inflammatory response. The agranulocytes are the lymphocytes and monocytes. The lymphocytes, they produce antibodies and other chemicals destroy microorganisms. They contribute to allergic reactions, rejection of grafts. So if you have a skin graft or even any sort of organ transplant, they would see that as a foreign substance. It's a foreign part of your body. It doesn't have the same antibodies on it, and so it would reject it. Monocytes are the largest white blood cells, and they become macrophages. So they go around and phagocytize different cells. They help break down the red blood cells in the spleen. So they just engulf a lot of foreign substances. And last part, the platelets, the thrombocytes, they have a lot of glycoproteins and proteins that adhere. They kind of are sticky, especially when the clotting factors have been produced or a tissue has been damaged. Then they will kind of stick to that damaged part and form a platelet plug to help stop the bleeding. It's not as permanent as a clot, but it is one of the first steps in controlling bleeding that we'll talk about tomorrow. The answer to this one is E. Answer is C. The answer is B, red blood cells. The answer is C, hematopoiesis. The answer is D. This one's a little tricky. They are biconcave discs, not biconvex discs. The answer is D. The answer is C, because they produce the heparin and histamine. The answer is C. And the answer is D.